The calm before the storm. October 24, 1962. In the depths of the Caribbean, aboard the Soviet submarine B-59, Captain Valentin Savitsky stared at the sonar readings. The warm waters of the Sargasso Sea betrayed no hint of the American fleet shadowing them. But tension rippled through the submarine's steel hull. Savitsky knew that every movement could be interpreted as aggression. His crew, experienced yet anxious, whispered among themselves. They were hundreds of miles from home, carrying nuclear torpedoes that could ignite the world. The Cuban Missile Crisis had escalated to its highest point, and yet, in the confined space of B-59, time seemed to slow. Savitsky's hands clenched the metal rail. "We must stay calm. Decisions now will echo in history," he muttered, his voice barely above the hum of the engines. The crew nodded, their faces lit only by the soft glow of the control panels. Outside, the distant silhouettes of U.S. destroyers sent shockwaves through the water. The captain knew the Americans were tracking them, but would they strike? That question haunted every sailor aboard. The sonar operator, Ivan Maslenikov, broke the silence. "Captain, the surface ships are closing in. Depth charges. Oh, they're dropping them near our position." Panic flickered across the room. Savitsky's heart raced. Each explosion sent tremors through the hull, shaking the crew's confidence. He clenched his jaw. The protocol was clear: remain silent, evade detection, and survive. Yet the fear was palpable. Maslenikov's fingers trembled over the controls, sweat dripping down his brow. "They're not bluffing, sir," Maslenikov said, voice tight. Savitsky's mind raced through every Cold War scenario he had studied. The stakes were no longer theoretical. A single misstep could ignite global catastrophe. The Cuban shores, the Havana coastline, everything hung in a delicate balance. The room was heavy with anticipation. Every creak of metal, every echo of a sonar ping amplified the tension. And yet, no one spoke of retreat. This was the Soviet Navy. Survival meant strategy, not surrender. As the submarine dove deeper, the darkness outside matched the tension within. The walls seemed to close in, as if the Atlantic itself were conspiring against them. Savitsky paced the narrow corridor. His eyes darted to the small periscope window, where faint silhouettes of American destroyers cut through the waves. "We are being tested," he said, almost to himself. He remembered the countless briefings on American military tactics, precision strikes, psychological pressure, intimidation. The crew sensed his unease, but also his resolve. Each sailor had a role, and failure could mean annihilation. In the control room, navigator Sergei Filipov calculated the sub's trajectory with trembling hands. "Depth and speed within limits, Captain," he reported. Savitsky exhaled sharply. Every calculation mattered. The Americans could mistake hesitation for weakness, and hesitation could cost lives. Outside, the faint rumble of approaching destroyers echoed through the ocean like a distant storm. Inside, the crew exchanged glances, understanding the silent command: "Trust the captain." Fear was natural, but unity was their shield. Savitsky's thoughts drifted to home, Leningrad, distant and unreachable. Would his family ever know the courage required of him here? He shook his head. Personal considerations were luxuries he could not afford. The submarine was a microcosm of Cold War politics, a steel crucible where human emotion collided with ideology. Every sonar ping, every mechanical vibration, carried weight beyond comprehension. Outside, the American fleet maintained its pattern, a calculated dance of intimidation. Inside, the crew's murmurs filled the confined space, a chorus of anxious anticipation. Savitsky had trained for this, yet training was no armor against the reality of potential nuclear engagement. He tightened his grip on the wheel, a silent promise to steer them through the storm. The atmosphere was thick, the tension almost tangible, like a rope stretched to its breaking point. One miscalculation, one premature signal, could transform this underwater mission into global tragedy. And yet, amidst the fear, a sense of duty prevailed. The first depth charge exploded nearby. The hull shuddered violently, metal groaning in protest. "Steady, men," Savitsky commanded, though his voice betrayed a flicker of anxiety. The crew responded, hands gripping the railings, eyes wide. In the cramped quarters, whispers of disbelief circulated. Could the Americans truly mean to strike? Savitsky knew better than to hope for mercy. The United States had already proven its willingness to escalate the crisis. Every decision was a gamble with millions of lives at stake. He glanced at Maslenikov, whose face was pale but resolute. "Captain, they're testing our limits," he said. Savitsky nodded silently. This was no bluff. The Americans were ready, precise, and ruthless in their approach. The realization sank in slowly, a cold wave of dread tempered only by the resolve that had carried them this far. Outside, the ocean remained deceptively calm, mocking the storm of tension within. By mid-morning, October 24th, B-59 had been under constant surveillance for hours. The sonar readings were clear. The Americans knew their exact position. Every course adjustment was mirrored by the destroyers above. Savitsky felt the weight of history pressing down on him. He remembered the words of Soviet naval doctrine: maintain composure, never reveal panic, trust in your training. Yet the reality was different. The fear was not just for themselves, it was for the millions back home who would be affected by any misstep. He walked past the sleeping quarters, noting the tense faces of his crew, men trained for war but not for the psychological warfare that unfolded beneath the waves. Each heartbeat, each mechanical groan of the sub, was a reminder of the precariousness of their mission. Somewhere in the distance, the Caribbean sun reflected off the waves, a cruel contrast to the darkness enveloping B-59. Maslenikov approached Savitsky, voice tight. "Captain, the Americans are dropping patterns now. Depth and proximity, they're testing us." Savitsky nodded, his jaw tight. He knew what this meant. The Americans wanted to provoke a response, to see if the Soviet Union would strike. One wrong move, one signal interpreted incorrectly, and they could ignite the conflict everyone feared. His mind raced through possible courses of action. Dive deeper, signal Moscow, or prepare weapons. Each carried immense risk. He felt the tension physically, a knot in his stomach that refused to loosen. "Stay calm, but be ready," he said finally, his voice firm. "We are not the ones bluffing." As the day progressed, the crew remained on high alert. Filipov monitored the instruments relentlessly, reporting each subtle shift in the ocean currents or sonar feedback. The Americans above seemed to anticipate every move. The reality of nuclear weapons aboard the submarine loomed over everyone like a silent specter. The crew whispered among themselves, occasionally glancing at the captain for reassurance. He gave none, knowing that any sign of fear could spread through the vessel like wildfire. The tension was suffocating, yet necessary. Outside, the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the Caribbean waters. It was a calm facade for the storm below, a storm of nerves, fear, and unspoken dread. A sudden sonar ping caught everyone off guard. "Contact!" Maslenikov shouted. The room froze. The Americans had adjusted their position, narrowing the gap. Depth charges continued to fall rhythmically, each explosion shaking the hull. Savitsky closed his eyes briefly, imagining the consequences of misjudgment. "Every move counts," he whispered. The crew held their collective breath, knowing the tiniest error could trigger catastrophic retaliation. Outside, the destroyer's propellers churned the water into turbulent waves, echoing the chaos within. The captain's mind flickered to Moscow, to the Kremlin, to the leaders waiting for signs of action. But here, in the claustrophobic corridors of B-59, decisions were immediate, personal, and deadly. By evening, exhaustion settled in, yet vigilance could not waver. The crew rotated shifts, each man trying to maintain composure. Savitsky reviewed every map, every chart, calculating routes, evasive maneuvers, and potential outcomes. He knew the Americans would push the limits, testing for weaknesses. Every creak of the submarine, every echo of water pressure, heightened the tension. "We are the shield," Savitsky reminded himself silently. "History watches us." The weight of command pressed heavily on him. One wrong decision could mean nuclear engagement, a chain reaction beyond comprehension. The room was heavy with fear and resolve, the perfect storm of human tension in metal and water. Night fell over the Caribbean. The surface was calm, almost peaceful, hiding the deadly game beneath. Savitsky stood near the periscope, peering through the murky water. The American silhouettes were visible, methodical, precise. He felt the full gravity of his position, a captain making decisions that could affect millions. The crew around him moved like shadows, each performing their duties with mechanical precision, masking the fear behind stoic faces. Savitsky's mind drifted momentarily to his family, to the world beyond the ocean, realizing how small and fragile life seemed in this moment. Suddenly, the sub shuddered from another depth-charge explosion. The room jolted, alarms blared, and the crew clutched whatever they could. "Hold position," Savitsky barked. His voice was the anchor amid the storm. Maslennikov's face was pale, lips tight, yet he followed orders. Every muscle tensed, every thought focused. The Americans were not bluffing, they were testing the resolve of the Soviet Navy, probing for weakness. Savitsky knew the world was watching, even if only indirectly. One mistake could tip the delicate balance of power. As hours passed, the psychological toll became evident. Fatigue, fear, and adrenaline coexisted in every corner. Conversations were whispers. Movements were precise. The submarine's metal hull felt heavier with each sonar ping, each water vibration. Savitsky's mind replayed scenarios, calculated outcomes, and weighed risks. He remembered briefings. Never show panic. Trust your training. Trust yourself. The reality was harsher. Here, in the shadow of potential nuclear war, training collided with human instinct. The tension was almost unbearable, yet it forged focus and unity. By midnight, the critical realization struck Savitsky. The Americans were not bluffing. Every pattern, every calculated movement, every depth charge told the same story. They were ready for escalation, and any rash decision from B-59 could trigger disaster. His hands gripped the console, knuckles white. "We must endure. We must survive," he whispered. Outside, the Caribbean waters remained calm, an ironic contrast to the storm within. The crew understood the unspoken command: trust in their leader, trust in each other, and hope the world beyond never witnessed the outcome of this night. Subscribe for more videos. The tension peaks. October 25, 1962. The day began with the submarine still deep beneath the Caribbean Sea, its steel hull groaning under the immense water pressure. Captain Savitsky paced the control room, eyes scanning the sonar readings as if they held the answer to survival. Outside, the U.S. Navy Task Force 135 maneuvered above, relentless in their pursuit. Each depth charge, though carefully calculated by the Americans, shook B-59 with a shudder that resonated through the crew. "They're not going to stop, are they?" whispered Maslennikov, voice taut. Savitsky did not respond immediately. He understood the psychological game. The Americans were testing limits, forcing doubt into every decision. The crew, tense and fatigued, clung to the captain's calm. In this confined space, even a whisper could amplify fear. He exhaled slowly. "We survive by patience and precision," he muttered. Outside, the Caribbean waves reflected the rising sun, unaware of the drama unfolding beneath. The submarine's instruments continued to report activity. Echo patterns, sonar pings, and the telltale vibrations of destroyer propellers. Filipov, at the navigation console, noted, "Captain, they're closing in on our western flank. They're predicting our next move." Savitsky's gaze hardened. Every maneuver was anticipated. He remembered lessons from the 1961 Cuban naval exercises, where even minor errors had been exploited. "Then we must move differently," he replied, voice steady. The crew absorbed the words, their trust in Savitsky unshakable, even as anxiety rose like a tide. Outside, the deep blue waters offered no solace. The Americans were methodical, professional, and their intent unmistakable. Every decision Savitsky made now carried consequences beyond the metal walls of B-59. By late morning, the psychological pressure became almost unbearable. The crew's fatigue mixed with fear, creating tension that seemed to warp the air inside the submarine. "Captain, what if they strike? What if—" Maslennikov's question hung unfinished, the room heavy with dread. Savitsky interrupted gently but firmly. "We do not act on fear. We act on calculation. His hands moved over the controls, adjusting depth, speed, and orientation, trying to evade detection without provoking aggression. Outside, the destroyers dropped a series of depth charges, each one echoing like a distant drum of doom. The crew flinched with every shockwave. Savitsky's mind raced through scenarios, each more dire than the last. Yet, through it all, he maintained composure, aware that panic could be fatal. As the day wore on, minor incidents within the submarine reminded everyone of their fragility. A valve malfunction caused a sudden hiss of escaping air, triggering a brief panic among the crew. Savitsky quickly assessed the problem, issuing calm, precise instructions to repair it. "Every second counts," he reminded them. Maslenikov nodded, returning to sonar duties with renewed focus. The Americans above seemed to anticipate these small errors, exploiting them to maintain psychological dominance. The submarine became a crucible of nerves, metal, and water pressure. Every heartbeat was amplified in the echoing corridors, every decision a gamble with the fate of millions. Mid-afternoon brought a momentary lull in the depth-charge bombardment. The crew exhaled collectively, but Savitsky knew better than to relax. The calm was deceptive, a tactical pause, allowing the Americans to analyze their next move. He observed his crew closely, tension etched in their features, eyes flicking nervously between instruments. "They're watching us, feeling our hesitation," he said quietly. "Do not give them reason." Outside, the Caribbean waters betrayed no clue, yet sonar readings showed destroyers adjusting formation, closing in strategically. Every decision now carried a weight that could not be measured in lives alone. It was a test of wits, endurance, and courage. By early evening, B-59 had reached periscope depth, a risky maneuver but necessary to assess the fleet above. Savitsky took the periscope in hand, scanning the horizon. The Americans maintained formation, methodical, precise. One destroyer altered course slightly, a calculated gesture meant to provoke. Savitsky's knuckles whitened around the periscope. He recalled Soviet naval briefings emphasizing the danger of misreading American tactics. "Every signal they send is a message," he murmured. Maslenikov nodded, tension radiating from every pore. The crew understood the unspoken truth. They were teetering on the edge of a decision that could trigger nuclear escalation. The sun dipped low, casting an eerie glow through the murky water. Inside B-59, tension reached a fever pitch. Savitsky called a meeting with his officers. "We are not here to provoke. We are here to survive, to follow orders and avoid catastrophe." Each officer nodded, understanding the dual responsibility, to obey the chain of command and to safeguard humanity itself. Outside, the destroyers' sonar pings reflected their precision, probing for the slightest sign of aggression. The crew was aware that any movement could be interpreted as hostile. The room felt smaller with every passing minute, the ocean above a vast, silent judge. A sudden sequence of depth charges rocked the hull violently. Alarms blared. "Brace!" shouted Savitsky. The crew fell into practice positions, training overriding instinct. The psychological pressure was immense. Every echo from the depth charges resonated through their bones, every vibration a reminder of the stakes. Maslenikov swallowed hard, eyes wide. "They're serious," he said. Savitsky didn't need to answer. The truth was undeniable. The Americans were not bluffing. Every action was deliberate, every pattern a signal of readiness. Nightfall brought no relief. The crew rotated shifts, exhaustion battling vigilance. The submarine's corridors were tense and silent, the only sounds coming from machinery and occasional murmurs. Savitsky reviewed tactical maps repeatedly, calculating evasive maneuvers. Outside, the surface was deceptively calm. The destroyers above seemed almost casual, yet their movements were anything but. Savitsky realized that the Americans had mastered the art of psychological warfare. They were testing endurance as much as position, measuring patience against panic. An unexpected sonar reading indicated another destroyer closing in from the east. "Captain, contact approaching," reported Filipov. Savitsky felt a wave of anxiety but pushed it aside. "Adjust course gradually. Maintain silence. We do not give them reason to react," he ordered. The crew followed, hands steady despite the fear gnawing at their minds. The submarine responded slowly, the steel hull groaning under water pressure. The Americans above, precise and relentless, adjusted to their movements instantly. Savitsky understood the stark reality. They were being studied, tested, and potentially pushed toward a critical threshold. Hours stretched into tense eternity. The crew spoke in whispers, exhaustion evident but suppressed by duty. Savitsky reflected on the global stakes. Moscow, Washington, Havana, all watching, even if indirectly. Every decision he made could ripple outward, shaping history. He looked at his officers, seeing fear, resolve, and trust intertwined. Maslenikov caught his gaze and nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the shared burden. Outside, the destroyers maintained their patterns, never giving the crew of B-59 the comfort of certainty. Every echo, every shadow, was a test of nerve. In the early hours of October 26, the submarine approached a critical juncture. Depth charges had increased in frequency, the vibrations almost unbearable. Savitsky called for a tactical discussion. "We must choose carefully," he said, voice calm but heavy with tension. "Every move is observed. Every decision could spark consequences we cannot undo." The crew exchanged silent glances. They had trained for conflict, but not for the weight of history pressing down in metal and water. Outside, the ocean surface reflected moonlight, a stark contrast to the darkness within. As dawn approached, the B-59 had survived another harrowing night, yet the realization solidified: the Americans were not bluffing. The destroyers above were precise, disciplined, and ready. Savitsky understood that they were engaged in a high-stakes psychological duel. He addressed his officers. "We endure. We calculate. And we trust our training." The crew absorbed his words, their tension coexisting with cautious hope. Outside, the Caribbean waves rolled on, indifferent to the human drama below. The captain's mind wrestled with the enormity of responsibility, knowing that the coming hours could determine the course of history itself. The edge of decision and aftermath. October 26, 1962, dawned gray and tense over the Caribbean Sea. Inside B-59, Captain Valentin Savitsky stood by the periscope, his eyes scanning the distant silhouettes of the American destroyers. Each ripple of the water, each sonar ping, reminded him of the precarious balance between life and annihilation. The crew, fatigued yet disciplined, moved with mechanical precision, aware that every action, even a misstep in a routine procedure, could trigger catastrophe. "We are walking a tightrope over history," Savitsky whispered. He recalled briefings from Moscow, warnings about American tactical precision. But nothing had prepared him for the suffocating reality of being hunted in the deep, nuclear-armed, and isolated. Fear and responsibility intertwined in the narrow corridors, creating a tension that could be felt in the very metal of the submarine. Maslenikov's voice broke the silence. "Captain, the destroyers are maintaining depth charge patterns. They are escalating, testing our responses." Savitsky nodded, exhaling slowly. He understood the implication. The Americans were forcing a critical decision, measuring resolve, and daring the Soviet crew to act. "We respond only if we must," he said firmly, voice calm despite the storm inside. The crew absorbed the words, trusting the captain's judgment. The decision before them was not just about survival. It was a test of morality, duty, and global responsibility. Outside, the Caribbean waters appeared calm, a stark contrast to the chaos beneath the surface. The calm facade was deceptive. The tension inside B-59 was as thick as the steel walls that enclosed them. By mid-morning, exhaustion began to erode the crew's composure. The confined space of the submarine amplified every sound: the hum of machinery, the echo of footsteps, the subtle groans of the hull. Savitsky walked past the officers' stations, observing their focused but strained expressions. "Every man here carries the weight of the world," he thought. He knew that a single mistake, an impulsive response, or misinterpreted signal could trigger a nuclear war. The crew exchanged glances, silently acknowledging the danger and the responsibility they bore. Outside, the destroyers above remained relentless, their movements precise and disciplined, sending unspoken messages of both intimidation and challenge. Savitsky called the officers together for a critical briefing. "We must decide our next maneuver carefully," he said. "We are not here to provoke, but we cannot allow ourselves to be cornered." The tension in the room was palpable. Filipov adjusted charts, Maslenikov monitored sonar, each action deliberate and meticulous. The decision before them was almost unthinkable: to remain silent and risk misinterpretation, or to signal Moscow and potentially escalate the crisis. Every man understood the consequences, and yet discipline held firm. Outside, the ocean reflected sunlight, indifferent to the human drama below, while the Americans tested the limits of their endurance and resolve. Suddenly, a series of deeper, more forceful depth charges shook the submarine violently. The crew braced instinctively. "Brace positions," Savitsky commanded. The echoes of the explosions reverberated through the metal hull, sending shivers down every spine. Maslenikov swallowed hard, knowing these were not mere tests, they were deliberate measures to provoke, to push them toward action. Savitsky's mind raced through all scenarios, weighing the risk of a retaliatory strike against the imperative to survive. The weight of history pressed upon him with every vibration of the ocean above. Hours passed with agonizing tension. The crew rotated shifts, but vigilance never wavered. Every ping of the sonar was dissected for hidden intent, every movement of the destroyers analyzed. Savitsky reflected on his training and experience. Patience, precision, composure. These lessons were now life-or-death mandates. He spoke softly to Maslenikov. "Remember, they are not bluffing. We must endure, observe, and act only if absolutely necessary." Outside, the destroyers maintained patterns that could have been mistaken for aggression, but Savitsky understood the psychological sophistication behind them. The Americans were testing endurance, willpower, and decision-making under extreme stress. At midday, Savitsky made a decisive order: maintain stealth, evade detection, and refrain from initiating any offensive action. The crew moved with renewed determination. Each maneuver was precise, calculated to avoid detection without provoking further attacks. The psychological tension remained intense, but discipline prevailed. The Americans above adjusted patterns as expected, yet the Soviet crew's restraint was unwavering. Savitsky's decision was not just tactical, it was moral, a recognition that the lives of millions outweighed personal survival instincts. By late afternoon, the depth charges had slowed, the American fleet apparently reassessing the situation. Relief rippled through B-59, though it was tempered by exhaustion. Savitsky walked among his officers, observing their fatigue but also their unwavering commitment. He spoke quietly. "We have endured. We have acted wisely. History will remember restraint as courage." The crew absorbed the words, knowing they had survived not by luck alone, but by discipline, trust, and careful decision-making. As night fell, the captain allowed himself a brief reflection. The Caribbean waters, calm and serene above, contrasted sharply with the storm of fear, courage, and duty below. Savitsky thought of Moscow, of Washington, of families awaiting news that would never fully convey the tension of these hours. He knew that the survival of B-59 had been a narrow victory, a testament to restraint under unimaginable pressure. Maslenikov watched silently, understanding the weight of command and the burden of history that their captain carried. The next morning, October 27, 1962, brought a subtle shift. The Americans had relaxed their patterns, withdrawing slightly. The crew sensed a reprieve, though vigilance remained paramount. Savitsky addressed the officers. "We will return to base. We have proven that discipline, calculation, and courage can prevail even against overwhelming odds." His voice carried relief, but also a solemn recognition of the ordeal endured. Every man understood that their actions had helped prevent catastrophe, that restraint could be as heroic as boldness in times of war. As B-59 began the long journey home, the crew reflected quietly on the experience. Maslenikov whispered to Savitsky, "We saw the edge of decision, Captain. We could have triggered disaster." Savitsky nodded, silent, contemplating the weight of nuclear responsibility. Each sailor bore the knowledge that inaction, when guided by wisdom, had saved countless lives. The Caribbean sun reflected on the waves, innocent and indifferent, yet the memory of tension lingered in every corridor of the submarine. By the time B-59 reached Cuban waters, the immediate danger had passed, yet the psychological impact remained. The crew's faces were etched with exhaustion, relief, and awe at what they had survived. Savitsky addressed them one final time. History is not always about action. Sometimes, restraint is the courage that prevents war. The officers nodded solemnly. Their journey had been more than tactical. It had been an ethical crucible, a test of nerve, morality, and human endurance. Back in the Soviet Union, news of B-59's ordeal was closely guarded, classified within the annals of Cold War secrecy. The world outside remained unaware of how close humanity had come to nuclear catastrophe. Savitsky would later recall the events with a mixture of relief and lingering tension. Every decision, every maneuver, every second of restraint had contributed to a fragile peace. The lessons were clear. Even in the most constrained and pressured circumstances, wisdom and discipline could prevail. Savitsky's final reflection to his crew encapsulated the ordeal. We faced the edge, and we chose life, prudence, and humanity. Let history remember that courage is not always in the strike, but sometimes in restraint. The crew absorbed the words, knowing the magnitude of what they had survived. And to the viewers watching this story unfold, would you have made the same choice if you were in the captain's position? Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more Cold War videos.